السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد أشرف الخلق وسيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم، وتب علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم. اللهم اغفر لنا ما قدمنا وما أخرنا وما أسررنا وما أعلنا وما أسرفنا وما أنت أعلم به منا. اللهم نسألك الجنة ونعيمها ونعوذ بك من النار وجحيمها. يا ربنا تقبل منا رمضان، ربنا تسلمه منا كاملا غير منقوص، واجبر ما كان فيه من خطأ أو خلل أو نسيان. اللهم ربنا وفقنا لشهود رمضانات كثيرة في أزمنة مديدة. اللهم ربنا بارك لنا في أعمارنا، وبارك لنا في أعمالنا، وبارك لنا في أرزاقنا. اللهم أطل أعمارنا في طاعتك، اللهم أطل أعمارنا في طاعتك، اللهم أطل أعمارنا في طاعتك. اللهم اختم لنا بخير أجمعين، والحقنا بالصالحين، واجعلنا من ورثة جناتك جنات النعيم. آمين آمين. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين. Before we begin the lecture, we make dua for the father of our brother Mustafa, who passed away 2 days ago, I believe, from COVID. He's also the uncle of brother Rafiq, and we ask Allah Azza wa Jal to have mercy upon him and to raise his status and to give him the reward of Shahada. By the blessings of the month of Ramadan, we ask Allah Azza wa Jal to give him the highest status in the Akhirah, and that He make his grave a garden from the gardens of paradise, not a pit from the pits of hellfire. We ask Him to make his amal salih, his good deeds, a comforter for him in his grave. Allahumma اغفر له وارحمه وعافه واعف عنه وتجاوز عن سيئاته. اللهم أكرم نزله ووسع مدخله وجاف الأرض عن جنبيه. اللهم إن كان محسنا فزد في إحسانه، وإن كان مسيئا فتجاوز عن سيئاته. اللهم اغسله بالماء والثلج والبرد، ونقه من الذنوب والخطايا والآثام كما ينقى الثوب الأبيض من الدنس. اللهم اجعل مأواه الجنة ولا تجعل مأواه النار. اللهم اجعل مأواه الجنة ولا تجعل مأواه النار. اللهم ابدله دارا خيرا من داره، وأهلا خيرا من أهله، وجيرانا خيرا من جيرانه، وارزق أهله الصبر والسلوان، واجمعهم به في جناتك جنات النعيم. آمين آمين. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين. أما بعد, before beginning with the subject of the grave and the life of the grave, it's very important, absolutely essential, that we take advantage of these nights, because we really don't know if this is the last time we experience the last 10 of Ramadan. And yesterday, actually this is a distant relative to my family. Yesterday, one of the brothers, he passed away after witnessing the 21st night, praying Fajr, going home to sleep, and he did not wake up. Rahimahullahu rahmatan wasi'ah. They had his janazah and they all made dua for him. But that's the reality of life. The reality of life is we can quickly transition out of this dunya at any moment without warning. If I knew that yesterday's odd night was my last time praying to Allah Azza wa Jal, how would I take advantage of it? How would my prayers be? What would my focus be? That's the qisar amal that the companions had. They always lived their lives in a way with a sense of urgency. إِذَا أَصْبَحْتَ فَلَا تَنْتَظِرِ الْمَسَاءِ. If you wake up in the morning, don't wait to see nightfall. If you go to sleep at night, don't wait to see daybreak, because you don't know if it will ever come for you, and Allah knows best. Now, when it comes to the grave and the barzakh, we mentioned yesterday about death, and how the beginning to the transition of the afterlife starts with death, and that's a reality that our Prophet ﷺ taught us to always remember. Not so we could always be depressed, not so we could always be gloomy. No. For the mu'min, we said yesterday, the sadness that is linked with death is for the ahya, losing a loved one, having a big change happen in your family, or losing a dear friend, or seeing a tragedy. That's for the ahya, those living. As for the amwat, as soon as the soul leaves the body, that's it. وَالْتَفَّتِ السَّاقُ بِالسَّاقِ. One chapter ends, a new chapter begins. It's not depressing for the mu'min, and that's what Allah tells us. It's not my words. There's reason for depression, there's reason for sadness, because we're going into the unknown. We don't know what's going to happen. It's a different world. But Allah Azza wa Jalla, He says, تَتَنَزَّلُ عَلَيْهِمُ الْمَلَائِكَةُ أَلَّا تَخَافُوا وَلَا تَحْزَنُوا. The reason's there, but sadness, anxiety, sorrow, it's not there. Because Allah Azza wa Jalla gives comfort for the mu'min through the angels. أَلَّا تَخَافُوا وَلَا تَحْزَنُوا. So this reality of death is something that we're always taught to remember. Even in the dua of the Prophet ﷺ, when we go to sleep, he teaches us to say, بِسْمِكَ رَبِّي وَضَعْتُ جَنْبِي وَبِكَ أَرْفَعُهُ إِنْ أَمْسَكْتَ نَفْسِي فَارْحَمْهَا وَإِنْ أَرْسَلْتَهَا فَاحْفَظْهَا بِمَا تَحْفَظُ بِهِ عِبَادَكَ الصَّالِحِينَ. O Allah, I put my side in your name. And in your name I raise up once again, if you will. وَبِكَ أَرْفَعُهُ إِنْ أَمْسَكْتَ نَفْسِي فَارْحَمْهَا. If you take my soul, have rahmah with it. And if you give it back to the body once again, then preserve it like you preserve your righteous servants. This is the words of our beloved Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ makes it clear, or the Quran makes it clear to us. Death comes to us, we don't go to it. من قبل أن يأتي أحدكم الموت. الموت هو الذي يأتي. Death comes to us, not us. Not we go to death. It comes to us. So now getting into the subject about the barzakh. What is the barzakh? What does barzakh mean? البرزخ في اللغة هو الحاجز بين الشيئين. البرزخ is a barrier, a bridge between two things, two entities. وكل حاجز بين شيئين فهو برزخ. مرج البحرين يلتقيان بينهما برزخ لا يبغيان. One of the miracles of the Quran, it tells us about the two oceans, where they meet. Or the two bodies of water, I should say, where they meet. One salty, one fresh. You find between them there is a barzakh, a barrier. They don't mix. This is what the Quran says. And then another verse says, كَلَّا إِنَّهَا كَلِمَةٌ هُوَ قَائِلُهَا وَمِنْ وَرَائِهِمْ بَرْزَخٌ إِلَى يَوْمِ يُبْعَثُونَ. So this life, the life of the grave, is referred to as al-barzakh, because it is a barrier. We can't get the news of the life of the grave except if we have a hadith, a verse. And the life of the grave is a barrier because it's a bridge between the akhirah and the dunya. It's a special life, the life of the grave. And that's why the mu'min doesn't experience the full experience of Jannah while he's in the grave. He gets doses. And when he sees these doses, he says, رَبِّ عَجِّلِ السَّاعَةِ كَيْ أَرْجِعْ إِلَىٰ أَهْلِي وَمَالِي. Oh Allah, hasten the hour so I could go back to my family. That's why one of the na'im of the people of Jannah, it's mentioned in Juz' Amma, وَيَنْقَلِبُ إِلَىٰ أَهْلِهِ مَسْرُورًا فَأَمَّا مَنْ أُوتِيَ كِتَابَهُ بِيَمِينِهِ فَسَوْفَ يُحَاسَبُ حِسَابًا يَسِيرًا. He's going to be dealt with very leniently. And the next na'im that comes to him, وَيَنْقَلِبُ إِلَىٰ أَهْلِهِ. He'll go back to his family. He'll reunite with them, مَسْرُورًا, in a state of utter happiness. The visiting the graves is a sunnah that is established by our beloved Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ, as reported in the hadith by Sayyidah Aisha, she says, كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم كلما كان ليلتها من رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يخرج من آخر الليل إلى البقيع فيقول السلام عليكم دار قوم مؤمنين وأن أتاكم ما توعدون وإنا إن شاء الله بكم لاحقون اللهم اغفر لأهل بقيع الغرقد. The Prophet ﷺ said, or the Prophet ﷺ, when it would be the turn of a Sayyidah Aisha, at the very end of the night, he would go out to the grave, al-Baqi', and he would greet them. Okay, that means they can hear. The people of the grave, when people come visit them, they can feel that. They can hear that. And then as for the verse that says, إِنَّكَ وَمَا أَنْتَ بِمُسْمِعٍ مَنْ فِي الْقُبُورِ, that's something else. The verse that says, you cannot cause the people in their graves to hear, meaning they can no longer benefit from what you have to say. their book of deeds is closed. They cannot respond. That's it. They disbelieved. That's it. Their book is closed. So that's what وَمَا أَنْتَ بِمُسْمِعٍ مَنْ فِي الْقُبُورِ means. But the Prophet ﷺ greets them. It means they can hear. Or else what would be the point of greeting them if they cannot hear? He would say, Assalamu alaikum, dara qawmin mu'mineen. Oh, Assalamu alaikum, O abode of believers, the people of Al-Baqiyah. He then would say, Ataakum ma tu'adun. What you've been promised has come to you. That beautiful promise from Allah Azza wa Jal. And he said, غَدًا مُؤَجَّلُونَ. We, as for us, we still have some time in this dunya. وَإِنَّا إِنْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ بِكُمْ لَاحِقُونَ. Inshallah, we're going to follow you. And then he would make dua for them. Allahumma ghfir li ahli baqi' al-gharqad. Oh Allah, forgive the people. So this is a sunnah. When we visit the grave, we greet the people of the grave. And we say this dua of our beloved Prophet ﷺ. Another dua that he would say is, Assalamu alaikum ya ahl al-qubur. Yaghfirullahu lana wa lakum. Antum salafuna wa nahnu bil-athar. This is other dua he would say sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, as reported in Sunnah al-Tirmidhi. Oh, greetings, O people of the grave. May Allah forgive you and forgive us. And then he would say, Antum salafuna. You are our salaf, our predecessors. And we are your athar. We're following you. So visiting the graves is a sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. In fact, outside of burials, outside of the time of burial, this sunnah, according to most scholars, is actually for men and also for women. Outside of the time of burial, at the time of the burial it should not be, because it'll lead to ikhtilat and it'll lead to excessive expression of sadness and wailing and all that, and this is something that is not allowed. So outside of the time of burial, it is even recommended for males and for females. The Prophet ﷺ, he says in the hadith, كنت نهيتكم عن زيارة القبور فزوروها فإنها تذكر بالآخرة. Visit the graves. It reminds you of the hereafter. It softens the heart. أكثر من ذكر هادم اللذات. If you feel like your heart is hard, you're getting so caught up with fights, feuds, with work, with business, all that, go to the grave. أكثر من ذكر هادم اللذات. Frequent your reminder of the destroyer of pleasures, because that's what death is. It destroys the pleasures of this dunya. Now, there's another hadith that tells us something about the graves, the darkness and the light of the grave. This hadith is the Prophet ﷺ heard that the cleaner of the masjid passed away. Some narrations say it was a woman, and other narrations say it was a man. This companion would clean the masjid, and she or he passed away. And the Prophet ﷺ felt their absence. So he asked, and they told the Prophet, she passed away. So the Prophet ﷺ said, أَفَلَا كُنْتُمْ آذَنْتُمُونِي. Why didn't you tell me? So he said, take me to her grave. And then, and the hadith says, فَكَأَنَّهُمْ صَغَّرُوا أَمْرَهَا. The reason why they didn't say to the Prophet anything is because they didn't see it was a very big significant thing. This isn't someone who's very reputable, very well known who passed away. This is just an average person. They were the cleaner of the masjid. Then the Prophet ﷺ went to her grave, and it says, دُلُّونِي عَلَى قَبْرِهَا أو على قبره فصلى عليها ثم قال إن هذه القبور مملوءة ظلمة إن هذه القبور مملوءة ظلمة وعلى أهلها وإن الله ينورها لهم بصلاة عليهم. The Prophet ﷺ tells us these graves are in utter darkness upon their residents, and Allah gives nur to these graves with my dua for them. That's something, if you have a mother or a father who passed away, or a relative, someone in your family who passed away, make sure you regularly visit their grave. You make dua for them. Especially if you're the son or the daughter or a near relative, make sure you make dua for them. Perhaps because of you being one of their a'mal salihah. Perhaps Allah will bring nur to their grave, as we learn from this hadith of our beloved Prophet ﷺ. Utter darkness. That's what the grave is. Only one source of light. That is amal salih. Now, the other thing we learn from the sunnah about the grave is the questioning of the grave. After the Prophet ﷺ would bury one of the companions, he would turn to them and he would say, "Istaghfiru li akhikum, was'alu lahu at-tathbit, فَإِنَّهُ الْآنَ يُسْأَلُ." Seek forgiveness for your brother and ask that Allah gives him thabat, because he is being questioned now. Now, about this questioning, in fact, it happens soon after people leave. Because another hadith mentions that the mayyit, the deceased in his grave, hears the footsteps, the noise. You know that noise? Pay attention next time and link it with this. When you go to a janazah, there's commotion, people wanting to put the dirt, and people talking with each other, and then people making dua, or people crying. The mayyit feels that. And then the footsteps away from the grave, he hears it. حَتَّى إِنَّهُ لَيَسْمَعُ قَرَّعَ نِعَالِهِمْ, as the hadith mentions. And then it says, فَيَأْتِيهِ مَلَكَانِ, or in other narrations, أَتَاهُ مَلَكَانِ أَسْوَدَانِ أَزْرَقَانِ يُقَالُ لِأَحَدِهِمَا الْمُنْكَرُ وَلِلْآخَرِ النَّكِيرُ. These two angels, they have names, Munkar and Nakir. And the hadith goes on to say, فَيُجْلِسَانِهِ, they let him sit upright. How's he going to sit upright? No, different rules. Forget about the kafan, the shrouds, forget about the box, forget about the dirt, all of that, forget about it. Now new rules are in place. It's no longer about the body, it's about the soul. And that's why our deen tells us, don't make too much emphasis about the body. You want to put outward zina. Some people, they spend thousands of dollars. They want to put a very expensive tombstone, or they want to put flowers, or they want to put kada, kada. It's not about the body. No more, it's not about the body. Now it's the soul. And there's only one form of zina, that's the zina of the qubur. It's not the rock, it's not the flowers, it's not anything that you could put there. It's zinatul amal salih. That's the only beauty that's there. The beauty of amal salih, good deeds. So it says, the hadith says, that they ask him the three questions, and we mentioned this yesterday. And so Allah Azza wa Jal, He gives that person the ability to answer. He says, Ashhadu annahu abd, about Allah Azza wa Jal, He says, when he's asked about Allah, he says, Man Rabbuk? He says Allah. Ma dinuk? He says Islam. ما تقول في الذي بعث فيكم? He says, أشهد أنه عبد الله ورسوله. And then he'll be told, look at your place in hellfire. أبدلك الله به مقعدا من الجنة. And that's why Allah Azza wa Jal, He says, وَلِمَنْ خَافَ مَقَامَ رَبِّهِ جَنَّتَانِ. For one who fears the status of Allah, he'll have two jannahs. Where's the second jannah from? We know one jannah, one garden. Where's the second jannah from? That was the one that you had in hellfire. You have a ticket to both, Jannah and hellfire. If we end up being from Ahlul Jannah, that's it. The ticket to hellfire cancels out, expires, and instead you get a second ticket. You don't get one. Jannah is not about just having singular things. It's about having multiplied things. Because Allah's khaza'in are not limited. Allah's treasures are not limited. He can give 2, He can give 10, He can give as much as He wants. And this is something we learn about Jannah. And most of the things in Jannah, you don't find it one solitary thing. You find it multiplied. So that's وَلِمَنْ خَافَ مَقَامَ رَبِّهِ جَنَّتَانِ. Then the hadith, then he says that he sees those two places in Jannah that Allah Azza wa Jal has promised him. As for Al-Abd al-Kafir, as for the disbelieving one, he would say, La adri, I don't know what's the answer to these questions. And then he'll be told by the angels, La darayt wa la talayt ثم يضرب بمطرقة حديد ضربة بين أذنيه فيصيح صيحة يسمعها من يليه إلا الثقلين. He says, when he's not able to answer, he gets struck by the angel and punished, and he screams because of it, but because of the punishment. And everything hears him except human beings and jinn. And if they heard them, they would not be able to withstand it whatsoever. This is a scene from the grave. After the scene, what happens? For the mu'min, It is said, صدق عبدي فأفرشوه من الجنة وألبسوه من الجنة يفتح له بابا من الجنة فيأتيه من طيبها وروحها ويفسح له في قبره مد بصره. This tight grave, some people, they want to make spacious graves for their family members. Instead of getting one spot, they want to get two spots. They want it to be wide and spacious. It's not going to be spacious. No matter even if you get three, even if you get a house to build and you put your deceased in the, no. If you do it for two spots for other reasons, maybe so no one steps on the grave, then that's fine. But if it's with the intention of it being spacious for the deceased, it's not going to be spacious. The only thing that's going to make it spacious is his amal. يُفْسَحُ لَهُ مَدَّ بَصَرِهِ. He could see as far as his eyes can go. It's different rules. And he'll have an anis, a comforter. He won't be all alone, because we're human beings. Even with the soul only functioning, we're still human beings. And we're not meant for isolation. Some people choose isolation for themselves, but it's not good. It messes the person up. It's not good for most human beings to be in utter isolation. That's why one of the forms of psychological torture is to put someone in a cage 23 hours a day and have no access to any other human beings. It makes them savages. That's not a way to do corrections for people who have committed crimes. That's not what our deen teaches. So here, this person's in his grave, he has a comforter. What's that comforter? It's amal salih. He'll see it in the form of a very beautiful figure. And he'll say, Man ant? فَوَجْهُكَ الَّذِي يَجِيءُ بِالْخَيْرِ. Who are you? Your wajh and your face is one that brings goodness with it. He says, أَنَا عَمَلُكَ الصَّالِحِ. I'm your good deeds, I'm here to comfort you. As long as you're in this grave. Brothers and sisters, the reality of the grave is a very, very real one. The Prophet ﷺ, he says in the hadith, there is no sight, مَا رَأَيْتُ مَنْظَرًا قَطْ إِلَّا وَالْقَبْرُ أَفْضَعُ مِنْهُ. This hadith, authentic hadith, says, the Prophet ﷺ said, I've never seen anything except that the life of the grave, the reality of the grave is more terrifying than it. Except for the one whom Allah Azza wa Jal gives him comfort at that point. So it's a very, very serious thing. I need to prepare for my grave. How? How can I protect myself from this end result? The Prophet ﷺ tells us, make sure you read Surah Al-Mulk every day. Because that's going to protect you when you're all alone. Nothing else is going to protect you except what you do now to protect yourself in the akhirah. The Prophet ﷺ, he says in the hadith, إِنَّ سُورَةً مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ 30 آيَةً شفعت لرجل حتى غفر له وهي سورة تبارك الذي بيده الملك. It comes as an intercessor and a source of forgiveness for the person. And in another hadith it mentions that it is أمان من عذاب القبر وفتنة القبر. The punishment of the grave is very real. One time the Prophet ﷺ passed by a grave, and he said, two graves, and he said to the companions, إنهما ليعذبان وَمَا يُعَذَّبَانِ فِي كَبِيرٍ. They're being punished for something that most people don't see as very significant. But the first one, أَمَّا أَحَدُهُمَا فَكَانَ يَسْعَى بِالنَّمِيمَةِ. The first one, he was nammam. His tongue was very loose. He would hear something from this person about someone else, and he would go say it to that person. Oh, Fulan said this about you. Oh, Fulan was doing this and he mentioned you in a negative way. Kada, kada. Something that's very easy on the tongue. Nammam yu'adhabu fi qabrih. Nasallahu as-salama wal-afiyah. We ask Allah to protect us from that. And then the other one, وَأَمَّا الْآخَرُ فَكَانَ لَا يَسْتَنزِهُ مِنْ بَوْلِهِ. That other person, he was never in a state of purity, full purity. Now, his salah, his ibadah, all of it in question, punished in his grave for not doing his proper precautions to make sure that his ibadah is maqboolah and accepted. We want to get back to salah, so I'll conclude very soon. But the other thing to mention here is, or there's three more things I want to mention. The first is, هل الأرواح تتلاقى وتتزاور وتتذاكر أم لا? Do the believers in the graveyard, do their souls meet each other? As for one category of people, those who are being punished, forget about them. They're too busy with the punishment to be able to engage in such a thing. And of course this النار يعرضون عليها غدوا وعشيا. This is about Al Fir'aun. ويوم تقوم الساعة أدخلوا آل فرعون أشد العذاب. Day and night, punishment. And then when the hour sounds, O people of Fir'aun, go to the most painful punishment. This is a clear verse, so that's why if you find someone rejecting the concept of punishment in the grave, then this person is doing something that makes their faith in question. It's an ayah in the Quran. Munkir adhab al-qabr, the one who denies it, his faith is in question. There's an ayah in the book of Allah Azza wa Jal that establishes it. So this person, so anyway, about the people of the grave visiting each other. As for Ahl al-Iman, this is actually mentioned by a number of scholars. One of them, Imam Ibn al-Qayyim in his book Al-Ruh, he says about the two categories. The second category is الأرواح المنعمة المرسلة غير المحبوسة تتلاقى وتتزاور وتتذاكر ما كان منها في الدنيا. He says, as for the arwah of the believers, they do meet. They ask each other of the news of what is happening to their families. And there's different evidences that show this. Among them is يا أيتها النفس المطمئنة ارجعي إلى ربك راضية مرضية فادخلي في عبادي وادخلي جنتي. Some of them they say فادخلي في عبادي يعني ادخلي في زمرة أهل الإيمان من أهل البرزخ. Now you're with them, Zumrat Ahl al-Iman. This is one evidence for it. And there are other evidences beyond that. Ibn Kathir, he actually also adds to this. He says, وفيه دلالة على أن الأنفس تجتمع في الملأ الأعلى كما ورد في الصحيحين عن أبي هريرة إذا أوى أحدكم إلى فراشه فلينفضه بداخلة إزاره فإنه لا يدري ما خلفه عليه ثم ليقل باسمك ربي وضعت جنبي. He says, even when we're in sleep, the living and the dead, their arwah are in al-mala' al-a'la. They interact with each other. He says there's evidence for this. To the extent that some of the Salaf, they said, يقبض أرواح الأموات إذا ماتوا وأرواح الأحياء إذا ناموا فتتعارف ما شاء الله أن تتعارف. The living and the dead, during the minor death, major death, there's some interaction according to the knowledge of Allah Azza wa Jalla, and He's best aware. The second thing is beware of debt. Because this is one of the things that denies the person of experiencing the bliss of the grave. This is something mentioned in the hadith. نفس المؤمن معلقة بدينه حتى يقضى عنه. The mu'min, if he has debts to people in this dunya, his nafs is mu'allaqa, is held captive until that debt is repaid. So this is another thing that's mentioned about the grave. The last thing that I'll mention is the length of the life of the grave. Our understanding of it is that its length is according to a different time frame than the Ahl al-Dunya. In fact, this is actually mentioned about the Day of Judgment itself. There's a hadith that says, the Prophet ﷺ, he says, يوما كان مقداره 50,000 سنة ما أطول هذا اليوم فقال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم والذي نفسي بيده إنه ليخفف على المؤمن حتى يكون أخف عليه من صلاة مكتوبة يصليها في الدنيا. The Prophet ﷺ says even the Day of Judgment itself is meant to be very quick for the mu'min. He doesn't feel it. Same thing with the life of the grave, as is in more than one evidence. When the people on the Day of Judgment are resurrected, they'll be asked, how long did you live? They'll say, لبثنا يوما أو بعض يوم فسل العادين. They have a different realization of time. They don't know how long they've been in their grave. They don't know how long they've been dead. That's why we even have the Uzair, when Allah Azza wa Jal caused him to die for 100 years and then He resurrected him. كم لبثت? He says, قال لبثت يوما أو بعض يوم. It's a different time frame. Just like when we sleep, we don't feel like 7 hours, 8 hours passed. Different time frame. This is the last thing I say about the life of the grave. And I ask Allah Azza wa Jal to make us of those who their qubur are gardens of Jannah. This is actually from the words of the Prophet, by the way. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, إن القبر إما روضة من رياض الجنة وإما حفرة من حفر النار. It's either a garden of Jannah or a pit of hellfire. And we ask Allah Azza wa Jal that it is the former, not the latter. Allahumma ameen. And inshallah tomorrow we'll continue with the stations of the hereafter. Taqabbal Allahu minna wa minkum. And we're going to continue our salah in 3 to 4 minutes.